Welcome to Samara. To the casual traveler, it's a beautiful city on the Volga. During the Great Patriotic War, it was known as Kuibyshev, the reserve capital of the Soviet Union. If Moscow had fallen to the Wehrmacht, the heart of the empire would have beaten from here. Today, tourists flock to Stalin's bunker, descending 37 meters into the earth to see the mahogany desks and the maps of a war long over. History has a basement that most aren't allowed to enter. While the tourists are looking at the relics of the 1940s, 40 meters deeper, beneath the heavy clay and the reinforced concrete, lies Object 05. It doesn't appear on the civil defense maps. It wasn't built for the Politburo to hide in. It was built for something far more ambitious and far more terrifying. In 1954, Soviet science took a dark, vertical turn. While the world looked at the stars competing in a frantic race to put a man in orbit, the KGB's Special Department Number 12 was looking into the ice. They weren't building a weapon of mass destruction in the traditional sense. They were building a bridge to the future, one constructed from frozen human tissue. The goal was anabiosis, the perfect biological pause. Imagine the strategic advantage. A battalion of elite Spetsnaz that never ages, kept in a state of suspended animation until they are needed a century later. A cabinet of brilliant advisors who can be thawed out long after a nuclear strike has leveled the surface. In the eyes of the Kremlin, the human body was just another resource to be stockpiled, like oil, like gold, like grain. Object 05 was a masterpiece of subterranean brutalism. It was a factory of silence, where the temperature was regulated with obsessive precision. To build a world of sleepers, you need bodies. No, you can't just use anyone, you need ghosts. The subjects of Object 05 were people the state had already erased on paper, prisoners from the Gulag whose sentences had expired into thin air. Soldiers from remote Siberian outposts who had no living relatives. Men and women who, if they disappeared tomorrow, would leave no ripple in the pond of Soviet society. They were brought to Samara in windowless rail cars and lowered into the depths under the cover of the Metro 2 construction. By 1958, Sector G was fully operational. 100 vertical glass cylinders, filled with an experimental xenon protein gas, held 100 human beings in a state of total biological stasis. Their hearts beat once every 4 minutes. Their blood, replaced with a synthetic antifreeze, barely moved through their veins. They were the ultimate strategic reserve, the perfect silent citizens of a future that hadn't arrived yet. For the first few years, the reports were clinical. Numbers, temperatures, chemical balances. But by 1959, the air in the facility began to change. It wasn't the machinery. The cooling units were humming perfectly. It was the feeling. The scientists, men of ironclad logic and atheistic certainty, began to report a sensation of pressure. Not physical pressure, but a psychological weight. They felt it in the back of their skulls. A vibrating hum that seemed to synchronize with the low-frequency thrum of the facility. Then came the mechanical anomaly that defied every law of Soviet engineering. The head of the medical unit, a man who had spent his life studying the individual heart, looked at the main monitor in the early hours of a Tuesday morning. He didn't see 100 different heart rates. He saw 100 subjects, separated by meters of concrete and steel, had snapped into a perfect, unified rhythm. 100 hearts beating as a single drum. 100 sets of lungs, expanding in a collective breath. The sleepers were no longer a collection of bodies. They had become an organism. And then, the first scientists stopped dreaming. By the early 1960s, the science of Object 05 had moved past the boundaries of biology and into a realm that the Soviet leadership was completely unprepared for. The 100 subjects in Sector G were, by all physical metrics, stable. Their core temperatures remained a constant minus 30 degrees. Their hearts beat with the slow mechanical rhythm of a clock deep underwater. But the monitors began to record an impossible anomaly. It started with Subject 12, a former political prisoner from the Magadan camps. His electroencephalogram, or EEG, should have been a flat, nearly dormant line. Instead, it was firing with the intensity of a person in a state of high arousal REM sleep. A few hours later, Subject 88 showed the exact same pattern. Within 48 hours, the synchronization had spread to every tank in the sector. The data didn't make sense. By 1962, all 100 sleepers were sharing a single massive brainwave signature. They weren't 100 individuals anymore. They were a single moment, dreaming a single dream, in the absolute darkness 40 meters below the streets of Samara. Soviet science was rooted in dialectical materialism. If you couldn't touch it, it didn't exist. But the dream of Object 05 began to leak into the physical world. The staff of the facility, hardened KGB medics and engineers, started reporting the same identical nightmares. They would wake up in their bunk rooms, drenched in cold sweat with the metallic taste of ozone on their tongues and the smell of freshly turned earth in their nostrils. Then came the vibration. It started as a low-frequency hum in the ventilation shafts, but the engineers found no mechanical cause. The staff described it as a voice that didn't use sound. It was a pressure in their teeth, a rhythmic pulsing in their inner ears. It was as if the bunker itself was trying to speak through the concrete. The psychological infection claimed its first victim in the summer of 1963. Victor, a lead technician who'd been with the project since its inception, was found standing in front of Tank 44. He had been there for 12 hours without moving. When the security guards finally pulled him away, his eyes were still fixed on the frosted glass, tracking a movement inside the tank that no one else could see. Victor didn't scream. He didn't resist. He only whispered a sentence that would haunt the chief medical officer's journals until the day they were burned. He said, "They aren't waiting for a war to end. They are waiting for us to stop watching." From that moment on, the atmosphere in Object 05 shifted from scientific curiosity to raw, unadulterated survival. The staff began to realize that they weren't the jailers of a strategic reserve. They were the accidental midwives of a collective entity, a hungry psychic presence growing beneath the feet of an unsuspecting city. The KGB responded as the only way they knew how, with more security, more secrecy, and more isolation. They cut off the facility's connection to the surface telephone lines. They increased the sedative levels in the gas mixtures. They tried to drown the collective mind in a sea of chemicals. But the sleepers were no longer limited by their biology. They were learning. They were observing the guards through the sensors of the facility itself. The flickering lights, the fluctuating power levels, the sudden drops in oxygen. These weren't malfunctions. They were experiments. The sleepers were testing the limits of their cage. And as the calendar turned toward the winter of 1964, the vibration in the walls grew louder. It was no longer a hum. It was a countdown. The entity in Sector G was done dreaming. It was ready to wake up. November 12th, 1964. The night the Soviet state realized that some secrets cannot be contained by reinforced concrete. The crisis didn't begin with an explosion or a siren. It began with a missed check-in. At 300 hours, the surface communication post at the secret entrance, disguised as a standard electrical substation, failed to receive the hourly status code from the bunker's command center. Protocol dictated a 5-minute grace period. When that passed, the surface commander attempted to patch through via the hard line. There was no busy signal. There was no static. There was only the sound of an open line and a rhythmic, low-frequency pulsing that matched the vibration the staff had been reporting for months. By 4:30, a specialized KGB liquidator team, the precursors to modern tactical units, arrived from the regional headquarters. Their orders were clear: contain a suspected chemical leak or an act of sabotage. They expected to find bodies. They expected to find a crime scene. What they found was far more disturbing. When the team breached the primary airlock, 40 meters down, they were met with a wave of sub-zero air that had drifted up from the lower levels. The facility was perfectly intact. The lights were humming. The ventilation fans were spinning. In the cafeteria, the night shift's tea was still steaming on the tables. In the security office, the duty officers' sidearms were still in their holsters, draped over the backs of their chairs. But the officers themselves were gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no bullet holes, just empty uniforms, boots, and lab coats scattered on the floor, as if the people inside them had simply ceased to exist in the physical plane. The liquidators moved through the halls of Object 05 with their flashlights, cutting through a fog of condensation. Their boots crunching on a fine layer of frost that had begun to coat every surface. The deeper they went, the more the mechanical reality of the bunker seemed to warp. When they finally reached Sector G, the heart of the project, the lead officer halted the team. The 100 glass cylinders, once the proud display of Soviet Anabiosis, were destroyed. But they hadn't been shattered by a hammer or an explosive charge. The 5-centimeter thick tempered glass had been pushed outward, exploded from the internal pressure of the tanks. The subjects, the sleepers, were gone. The liquidators found a trail of bare, wet footprints on the concrete floor. They didn't lead toward the exit. They led toward the dead ends, the service tunnels that had been dug deep into the bedrock, tunnels that were never intended for human passage. These were dark, narrow shafts that descended even further into the crust of the earth, toward the geothermal heat of the planet. The most chilling discovery was made in the high-security vault at the very end of the sector. Behind a 3-ton steel door, they found the project's chief engineer. He hadn't been attacked. He was alive, huddled in the corner of the room. But he was no longer the man who had helped build Object 05. He had used his bare hands to carve a single word into the heavy steel of the vault door. He had worked with such frantic, anomalous strength that his fingernails were entirely gone. His fingertips raw and bloody, the word he carved, over and over again, was "my," the Russian word for "we." When the liquidators tried to question him, he didn't speak. He only mimicked their breathing. Every inhale they took, he took. Every exhale was synchronized. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a terminal, a single node connected to a much larger, invisible network. The decision from the Kremlin was immediate and absolute. This wasn't a rescue mission, it was a burial. The liquidators were ordered to evacuate, leaving the engineer behind. Within the hour, the surface commander gave the order to initiate the Aura protocol. Heavy industrial mixers were brought in under the cover of darkness. Thousands of tons of high-grade liquid concrete were pumped into the elevator shafts and the ventilation intakes. They didn't just fill the entrance. They pumped until the concrete began to back up, until the entire 40-meter deep complex was a solid, airless block of stone. They buried the equipment, the records, and the 100 sleepers who had walked into the dark. But as the concrete hardened, the vibration didn't stop. It just moved. It left the bunker and started to climb. The burial of Object 05 was completed in less than 72 hours. By the morning of November 15th, 1964, the industrial mixers were gone. The temporary floodlights were dismantled, and the substation that served as the bunker's primary skin was officially decommissioned due to a structural failure. The families of the 100 staff members, the doctors, the engineers, the cooks, were given a standardized explanation: a tragic high-pressure gas leak. No bodies could be recovered due to chemical contamination. They were given closed caskets filled with sand and a lifetime pension that came with a single, non-negotiable condition: silence. In the archives of the KGB, the dossier for the sleepers underwent a total linguistic erasure. It was no longer a biological experiment. It was reclassified as a failed geological survey. The files were moved to a specialized vault in the Ural Mountains, sealed under a 75-year state survival decree. This means the truth of what happened 40 meters beneath the Volga will remain property of the state until at least the year 2039. But concrete is only a barrier for physical things. In the decades following the liquidation, the Soviet government and later the Russian Federation monitored the site with a quiet, persistent paranoia. They didn't just walk away. A small, nondescript building nearby remains active today, officially listed as a seismic monitoring station. But the sensors aren't pointed toward the tectonic fault lines. They are pointed downward into the solid block of stone that was once a laboratory. Modern seismologists in Samara have occasionally recorded micro-tremors that defy standard classification. They aren't sharp, jagged spikes like an earthquake. They are rhythmic, slow, long, undulating waves that occur at exactly the same frequency every time. It is a biological signature, a collective expansion and contraction. The concrete buried the facility, but it didn't bury the dead ends, those unmapped tunnels the 100 subjects walked into. It didn't bury the geothermal depths where the temperature is high enough to sustain a consciousness that no longer requires a heartbeat. Today, the ground above Object 05 is covered by the mundane reality of the 21st century. People walk their dogs, children play in parks, and commuters drive to work, completely unaware that they are passing over a hive of 100 minds that learned how to dream together. But the leak that began in 1962 hasn't stopped. Residents of the surrounding apartment blocks often report a specific localized form of insomnia. They describe a feeling of crowding in their own bedrooms, a sensation that their private thoughts are being overheard, or worse, that their dreams are being shared by their neighbors. In Samara, there is a local saying among the older generation: never sleep with your head to the north wall. They don't know why they say it. It's just an instinct, a cultural scar left behind by a psychic infection that never truly left the soil. Soviet science tried to create a weapon of the future. They wanted a battalion that never aged. Instead, they accidentally created a new form of existence, a collective entity that broke the cage of the physical body and slipped into the very foundations of the city. The 75-year secret isn't about what happened in 1964. It's about what is happening right now. The classification exists because the state knows that you cannot kill a hive mind. You can only hope it stays in the dark. You can only hope it doesn't decide to wake up the rest of us. History in Russia is rarely a straight line, but it always leads back to a basement, whether it's the smoke of the apartment bombings or the frost of Object 05. The foundation of the state is built on things we are told to forget. But the earth remembers. The concrete remembers. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the city is silent and the vibration begins in the walls, you might realize that you aren't alone in your own head. This has been Russian Dark Stories. The truth is never buried deep enough. Good night, and keep your lights on.